Hey, welcome back to our Sunday night Bible studies. We've been studying the book of Joshua, and we're going to continue that today with Joshua chapter 3. I've got Corey, Jarrod, and Ricky with me, and just to kind of get us ready for what's happening in Joshua chapter 3, let's just kind of quickly review. Of course, the Israelites were in slavery in Egypt and escaped that, obviously, with God's help. They were in the wilderness for 40 years, and Moses was the leader the whole time there. Moses has died. Joshua has now become the leader. That's at the beginning of chapter 1. And last week we talked about Jericho and sending spies, the two spies into Jericho, and their encounter with Rahab. And kind of at the end of that chapter, which leads us into chapter 3, we see this phrase that God has given them the land, given the Israelites the land. Rahab says it, and then the spies say it as well after kind of their report of what's going on there. And that kind of leads us into chapter 3. So with this idea, keep that in mind the whole time of God has given them the land as we continue forward, not just in chapter 3, but also in the upcoming chapters here in Joshua as they take the land, basically, the promised land that they have been promised by God. Let's go ahead and start, I guess, in verse 1. Jarrod, you want to read that for us? And
All right, Joshua 3, chapter 1. Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. Then Joshua arose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim, and then they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. You want me to continue?
No, that's good right there. I know that's just one verse and we're stopping there, but I wanted to look at this phrase there at the very end of that verse, that before they passed over. In my research, and I don't know what you guys want to say about it, but that word there for passed over or crossover, the Hebrew verb, that occurs like 20 plus times in chapters 3 and 4 here. So this is the theme of what's going on, this idea of passing over, of crossing over. Technically, right now, they're not yet in the promised land.
Right.
And so they are, these two chapters are the description of them passing over. You guys want to weigh in on that?
Well, it's significant because it goes all the way back to Genesis 12 and the promises that God's been making to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all their descendants for centuries now.
And now it's going to be fulfilled. They're right up to the very cusp of the land. And you know, obviously these people knew about that. This group of Israelites, they knew about the promises, they knew all that, and I wonder what the excitement level was. This is what our people that's been building for all these hundreds of years, and now we're right here at the edge of it.
Well, you think about if you buy a house, that first time you walk through the door, going to Disney World, and the first time you walk through the gates into the Magic Kingdom or what, that pales in comparison a lot compared to this, obviously. But it's exciting as we are to step into a new world like that. How even more so it would have been for them.
Sure.
Or even from the standpoint of not being a Christian and crossing over and becoming a Christian. The water and the significance of the water. Here the significance of water as they cross from one side, they go through the water and to the other side. There's a lot of different angles. I think we could look at
that
this.
same theme continues to pop up in Scripture.
Right.
Or the excitement of, as sad as we are when someone we love that's in Jesus passes away, what's it like for them to cross over into the promised land for eternity?
Right.
So a lot of things we could talk about probably.
All right, let's keep rolling forward though. Verses 2 through 4. Ricky, can you read that for us?
So it was after 3 days that the officers went through the camp, and they commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it. Yet there shall be a space between you and it about 2,000 cubits by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way by which you must go, for you have not passed this way before.
Okay, so we've got the Ark of the Covenant presented here. That kind of takes us back to our studies back in Exodus and talking about the Ark and what is the Ark and what let's kind of get a description of it and kind of what it meant to the Israelites.
I think the overall thing is the presence of God. You know, that's kind of what it's representing there. And then, of course, it contains a lot more stuff. So,
And it's emphasizing the miracle that's going on, that
Right.
God is doing
God
this.
is the one that's doing
Just
that.
like Moses used his rod, now Joshua's going to be using the ark as kind of the symbolic thing that God's going to be the one.
well, in the
to use.
Exodus, God led the way, did he not?
Right.
You know, in different forms. And now it's the ark, which is still representing God's presence, is going to lead the way, and how awesome that is.
And you know, I found significant that prior to this, there was the pillar of fire and the cloud
Right.
leading the people. No more. That's not there anymore. Now it's the ark, and the ark is what's leading them as they go into the land.
Still the presence of God.
But it
it's
is
just
still the
in
presence
a
of God in a
different
different
form.
form, right.
Right. There's a phrase in there that kind of stuck out to me, and you guys might want to comment on this. In order that you may know the way that you shall go. What's it talking about there?
Well, they followed the right way. They had a leader. The ark was their leader, and they followed it, and so that's how they would know. What if it was left up to them? They wouldn't know exactly where to cross, what to do, how to do it, but they had a leader, so they learned the way to go. I think that's what it's talking about.
And we're going to see that when we get into following chapters, whenever God gives them, here's how to take Jericho, and they take Jericho. And then as a city we can take easily, and they don't go to God, and had they would have known there was sin in the camp and not had the problem. So, same for us, we got to follow God to know the right way to go.
I was just thinking about, we keep pulling these concepts from the Old Testament into our world today, and that in order that you may know the way you shall go, that phrase sticks out to me, I think, because the same is true for us. How do we know the way that we're supposed to go? It's by looking to God. Look at what He has given us to lead us, the Bible, the Word, and Jesus, and understanding those things. Though that's how we know how we're supposed to go.
Yeah.
So
Well, in Psalm 119, thy word's a lamp to my feet and a light to my way, and it guides our path. And I think you're exactly right. That's how we know the way to go today.
all right, verse 5, Corey.
Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you.
Okay, consecrate yourselves. What are we talking about here?
In the New King James Version, it has sanctify.
Okay.
And the word sanctify means to set apart. So we need to set ourselves apart for God.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he's saying here, consecrate or sanctify yourself.
It's the verb form of holy. And since we don't have holify yourself, then you have to have sanctify or consecrate.
And so that's how we sanctify ourselves. We become holy people.
And this isn't the first time we've seen that either. Back in Exodus, again, back to our studies there, we have seen the same idea of sanctify, consecrate. And even in Exodus 19, where that pops up, they're told specifically to wash themselves, wash their garments, I think is the phrase there. They're supposed to do these things to set themselves apart, to be different, to be holy, to be clean. And it even tells us kind of a why there, because God is going to do wonders among you. And I think there's something that has to do too with the idea of how close they're going to be to the presence of the Lord, as we see as they walk by the Ark of the Covenant.
Let's go back up to the previous verse.
Yeah, go ahead.
It says you stay back from it, or stay from it 2,000 cubits. That'd be like 1,000 yards.
Yeah, it's almost a half a mile.
Yeah. So why were they given instructions to stay back from the ark? Any thoughts on that?
That's a good question.
Well, I think it's so they could see. I mean,
that's
it's a
part of
very
it.
practical thing.
Yeah.
If you're right up on it, the Israelites they're so numerous they're not going to be able to tell really which
Right.
direction
I think
they're
that's
going.
part
I
of
think
it.
that's a part of it initially.
And I think also, because what does the ark represent? Remember what we said?
Presence
of God.
Right.
Okay. In the tabernacle, where's the ark? It's in the most holy place.
And who
Everybody doesn't have access to that.
Right.
So I think that's one reason why he's telling them to stay back, away from it, because it represents the presence of God, and maybe we could say that shows their fear, respect, and reverence for God.
Right.
So I think that's one reason.
I think one of the things that kind of comes to my mind here is most of us have played sports, and all of us kind of had like a pregame thing that maybe you did, in the locker room to get ready. I kind of had a pregame thing that I would do in the locker room before we went on the field, and that just kind of helped prepare my mind as I went over my calls and where I needed to be and that kind of thing. As I got ready for the game, here in verse 5, when he's talking about consecrating yourselves, they are preparing themselves in the understanding that something tomorrow that is fixing to take place is going to be phenomenal. Something tomorrow is going to be wonderful, and it's going to change our lives. And so the evening is dealt with that understanding. I am preparing for tomorrow because tomorrow is going to be just a phenomenal thing. You think about when a couple gets married, the night before the wedding, that all that stuff is going through their mind and making sure they got everything ready for tomorrow, because tomorrow, when we get married, our life changes. And something wonderful and new begins.
Well, and it says that in that verse there, verse 5, will do wonders among you. Hey, God's fixing to do something pretty cool.
Yeah. And in verse 4, he says the reason that they shouldn't come near it is because that you may know the way, because you haven't been here before.
Right.
And you think, you're probably going to talk about this later, but you think about, the time of year and how overrun of the banks and whatnot that the Jordan, it may have just been, I don't want you getting too close to the river, because you may try to cross it and you can't cross the Jordan River this time of year that they're in. So to step back and see God stop it 16 miles up the river, and now we're walking on dry ground. What an awesome sight that would be.
Right.
The other part of that is that they're having time that night to remember why they're in the situation they're in.
Yeah.
And what they've been doing for the past 40 years. And you got the older people talking about that from a young age when they were probably children or early teenagers, and they talk about remembering things. And then for 40 years, I've been walking and wondering, and tomorrow?
Yeah, when's this going to happen?
Yeah.
When's this going to happen?
Right.
When's this going to happen? And then now we're on the eve of the occasion.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, let's keep rolling here. Verse 10 through 13. Jarrod?
Okay. And Joshua said, "Here's how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Gerishites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites, and any other sites."
I'm so sorry. I didn't even realize that's the verses I was giving you. Keep
I
going.
appreciate
Keep
it.
going.
We were, Ricky and I are thankful.
Keep going. Keep going. Keep reading.
All right. "Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man. And when the soles of the feet of the priest bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap." You want me to keep going?
No, that's
Okay.
that's good right there. Man, there's a lot right there, and I know we skipped over a few verses to get down there. There's some repetition here about some of the things that's going on, so that's why we skipped a few verses, and you can go back and read that at some point if you want to. But remember that phrase that we said at the very end of chapter 2. God has given them the land. Right. This is it right here. He's describing what's fixing to happen. Joshua is telling them this, but where did this information come from? is from God. So God has given them the land. Here's the description of that in these 3 verses that we just read. And there are 7 people's groups that Jarrod just read.
There's a lot of ites that got a whole lot of ites there.
So, and what's going to happen to those people groups?
They're going to get moved out. You know,
Drive out. What does your version say, Ricky? Mine says drive them out. What does
Let's see.
verse 10? I think
Verse
it
10.
is.
without fail.
Drive out.
Yours says drive out too.
Yeah.
You were going to say something?
No.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were. So we've got this. God is giving them the land by driving out these 7 people groups, and then we've got something alluded to what we're going to talk about in the next chapter. We'll get to that in the next class. But talking about the 12 men from each tribe, that's going to talk. We'll talk about that in chapter 4, and then the description of how we're crossing over into the promised land, into where we're driving out these nations, is there in verse 13. Talk about that real quick. What is this description of what's fixing to happen? And we'll see a little bit more of that as we go along. But what's the description here?
Well, evidently, when the priests put their feet into, I don't know if they necessarily put into the water, but when they begin to get ready to go down into the water water stops. You know,
That's pretty good timing. As far upriver as this is going to take place, if it was, some of the naturalists try to describe this as, well, it was something that could be explained through a natural process and all, but that's pretty lucky that about the time that I put my sole of my feet in it, that all of a sudden 16 miles up, it stops and it's dry all of a sudden.
Yeah.
That's pretty good timing.
you know, kind of reminds you of something else that took place, right?
Yeah, we're getting there.
Yeah.
We're getting
So-
there. Let's not jump in.
You're
too
right.
much.
But that's going through your
Yeah.
mind as you're like,
You're already starting to
kinda,
think about this.
familiar.
This sounds really familiar
You know,
to something.
But you
that's
think
already
about that for even just the priests. You know, when they get ready to walk into the water, you know what's going through their mind. Like he's telling them, all right, I want you to go in, and they're thinking, I don't know if I can tread water that long.
That took
You
faith
know,
on their part.
Right. You know, maybe one of them can't swim. You know, and he's telling me I have to go get into the river, and then when they begin to go, and all of a sudden they're noticing something happen. You know, what's going through their mind? Much less the rest of the people that are watching.
Yeah.
Well, right now he's just telling them, hey, what's fixing to happen. They haven't actually done it yet.
Right.
So let's go ahead and get on to that part where he's actually done it. Before we leave this section, though, notice who is doing all of the giving of the land to them. Who's driving out the people? It's God. Who's cutting off the water? It's the Lord. I mean, he's the one who's in charge of this. He's the one, and it's just, I know it's important for us to focus on that, but oftentimes I think we forget that God is in charge, and we try to say so-and-so did this, or this was all me, you know.
We give credit to man
Yes.
instead of God.
Yes.
You know, and when we need to give credit to God, that God used a man and the talents of that man or woman, you know, to do those things, it's through God. I mean, that's how we have been given our talents and abilities.
Yeah, but it keeps pointing that out to us over and over. It's the Lord. It's God. It's the ark, which represents the Lord. You know, it's all of these things, and it just over and over again we see that. All right.
You know,
Yeah,
one
go
more
ahead.
thing, tying in with what we just said. Go back up to verse 7, that the Lord says to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you." So God's the one who does it, but they've got a new leader.
They're doing it through Joshua.
And so Joshua has begun to lead the people already, but now it's like, here's the first miraculous thing that's going to happen, and Joshua, I'm doing this, and you're involved, but I'm doing it, but now you're the leader, and I will exalt you. So if there's any question in anyone's mind, Joshua's the man now.
And God had told him back in chapter 1 he was going to do that.
Right. Exactly.
Corey and I were talking about this just yesterday, just kind of getting ready. And Corey, you said something about the transition from Moses to Joshua in the events that are taking place here. That Joshua now is the new Moses. And I think that's seen in that verse 7, and then we'll continue to see that going forward as well. The events that are taking place are very similar again to events that happened with Moses. So Joshua's the new Moses. He's the leader, but again, it's God doing those things. All right, verses 14 through 17. Ricky?
So it was when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priest bearing the ark of the covenant before the people. And as soon as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priest who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest, that the waters which came down from upstream stood still, and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Jarrod. So the waters that went down into the sea of the Arubah, the salt sea, failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priest who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan.
Okay, so we've had this description of what's going to happen. Now it's actually taking place, and here's all of this description of what's going on. You mentioned a moment ago, Corey, about the Jordan River. Let's expand on that a little bit here. What's the Jordan River? What's happening here that makes this miraculous? I guess that it has to be miraculous. This has to be God doing this rather than something that the Israelites are just doing themselves.
Well, you think about crossing a river. There's places in lots of rivers we can just walk across or wade across. But this time of year, you've got the snow melt coming down from the mountain. You've got the springtime rains coming in, and so this time of year, it's overflowing its banks. It talks
wet,
about
rainy season,
right? And it's such the Jordan means descending. It's such a sharp angle that it's descending on. It flows. I mean, it's going. Mm-hmm. So when you got that much water and it's going, like I said before, you just don't cross the Jordan River this time of year because of the amount of water, but also the rate in which it's going downhill. It's just impossible to cross unless there's some divine intervention.
Right, exactly.
Right, and we see the description of that divine intervention. My mind went to the game Oregon Trail, and you're on your way across the wilderness of the United States here, and you have to cross rivers as you go along, and some of them you can just take your
wagon.
Man, I couldn't come up with that word. Wagon, and just go straight across of it because it's shallow enough and it's not running strong enough. And then you've got some other options. But there are times when you get to a spot, hey, I can't cross right now. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the description of the Jordan River here is in a normal time, yeah, we could maybe cross at some spots. It's 100 feet wide. It's 3 to 10 feet deep. We can make that work. But with all this extra rain and the snow melts and the overflow, this is not a time you're crossing the Jordan River. Mm-hmm. And I think the Bible wants us to know that. God wants us to know that He's doing this.
And you get the emphasis too that they're on dry ground. Even if somebody upstream threw a bunch of rocks in and stopped the water, it's going to be mud and mire. To further show that this is a miraculous event, it's on dry ground that they're walking.
So that word dry ground and that the water's heaped up, those the two descriptions there. And what does that make us think of? We've been kind of dancing around it a little bit, not actually saying it, but where's the comparison here? What are we talking about?
The parting of the Red Sea. All right.
Okay, so this is to make us think back directly to the Red Sea. In fact, both of those phrases are used to describe the crossing the Red Sea with Moses, 40 some odd years ago, right? Exodus 15:8, the Song of Moses. Moses is describing after they've already crossed it, and he uses the word heap. The water is heaped up. And then, and actually in Exodus 14, the previous chapter, it describes them walking across the Red Sea on dry ground. It is clearly trying to make us think back to the Red Sea.
We're showing our age talking about the Oregon Trail game.
That's okay. That's all right. Significance of all that. What do we think? Why are we trying to think all the way back to the Red Sea? I know we've already talked about it a little bit, but what's going on here?
It's a remembrance thing. Why did they cross the Red Sea to begin with? They crossed the Red Sea because they came out of captivity, right? And so, again, it's making them go back and think about that, especially those who were really young, who might kind of vaguely remember. I mean, you remember stuff when you were 7 or 8 years old, but you don't remember like a whole lot of detail. And so if you got somebody that was 7, 8 years old now, they're 50, 47, 50 years old, getting ready to cross the Jordan, they vaguely remember some things, but now, I mean, they're really comprehending what's going on.
And as God told Joshua, I'm going to make you look like the leader in front of everyone.
Right. Let's talk about where the ark is. So we talked about where it was, and it was leading the people. But as the waters part, they're walking on dry ground. Where is the ark in the Jordan? Where is it?
It's right out in the middle.
It's right smack in the middle of the Jordan now, as opposed to leading, and the people. It's going to stay there, and the people are going to walk around it, right?
Right.
Again, I guess the presence of God is holding the waters where they want.
And so they're seeing that.
Mm-hmm.
They're seeing the power of God. If they haven't already seen it from some other things, they're definitely seeing it now.
Right.
That God is doing this. So.
All right, so we've covered a lot, but a couple of things to kind of wrap us up, I guess. You've got them leaving Egypt. They cross the Red Sea into the wilderness. They're going from slavery from Egypt to freedom, but it's in the wilderness. And they've been wandering around this wilderness for 40 years, and now they're crossing again. They're crossing the Jordan River, and now they're in the Promised Land. They've gone from wanderers to a nation, a people group. It's not just random people walking around. They're a people group. Let's think about that in its whole here. You're going from Egypt to the Promised Land, which is where they've been trying to get the whole time, right? That's what we keep saying. What does this represent overall? You go from Egypt to the Promised Land, and these crossings, what are they representing?
Well, we know there were obstacles that stood before them, and with God's help, they got through those obstacles. And going back to something you said earlier, water involved here in both times, and God stopped the water so they could pass through the water. Well, for us, in order to make it to the Promised Land, we have to pass through water. We have to obey the gospel, be baptized, and follow God. Again, the ark, they followed God, and we follow God, follow His word, and then that's what leads us to obey Him.
So this concept doesn't just stay back here in the Old Testament. Then is what you're saying. It continues this same idea. I was just thinking, you're going from slavery. It's the same thing you said, but just in different terms. You're going from slavery to freedom, right? And now we're in this new land. It's bringing them a new life, and that's how this is completing this process from death, slavery, to life. And those terms are used in the New Testament over and over again.
Exactly, yes.
And about this bringing new life. That's kind of the idea of baptism in the New Testament, is this new life of spiritual freedom. And something really cool to note, in Mark 1, verse 9, where is Jesus baptized? In the Jordan River.
Right.
The same place. That's what we're talking about here. It's the very very same place, this idea of new life. So I know sometimes we look at the Old Testament and we think, how does that really apply to us today? Sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes it's maybe not as obvious. But that's the concept here, is bringing them new life.
Well, I think another great thing to point out is them crossing over the river shows God is fulfilling His promise. The reason that He didn't fulfill His promise 40 years before was because of their lack of faith. And that's still true of God. God is going to fulfill His promises. His will is going to be done. It's a matter of whether we're going to get on board with it and be a part of it or not. And I think that's a great lesson that we can draw from the text as well.
And if we're going to get on board, you said, and do things the way that God wants us to do them, obviously they did things the way that God wanted them to do, crossing over here. But we'll see later that they don't always do what God wants them to do.
But God's going to fulfill His promises every time. We don't have to. That's not the question of the equation ever. In fact, that's a big point He's going to make later on in Joshua, is that all the land promise that God made, He fulfilled. And the promises He makes to us, like, I'll be with you, I won't let you be tempted above what you can bear, I'm preparing a place for all those things, He's going to keep those promises for us as well. And in a life full of uncertainty, as much has been said about 2020 and how uncertain it is, that's why it shouldn't bother 2020 shouldn't bother us, because we're building on dry, solid ground of God's promises that we're walking on. So,
anything else y'all want to add?
One other thing I'd say, getting back to what you said earlier about the Old Testament and the New Testament, I hope that during our study of Exodus and now what we're seeing here, I hope that everyone that's been watching has seen so many principles and figures of the Old Testament that are shown in the New Testament. And so it all works together. We can't discount the Old Testament and say, well, I'm not going to study it. We've got to study it in order to understand some things in the New Testament.
Which is what Hebrews is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what Hebrews
Written
does.
for our learning.
Yeah.
Well, and it's one story, too. It's hard to understand the New Testament if you don't have a grounding and a basis in the Old Testament. You want to understand some concepts. You want to understand why some things happened if you don't understand the Old Testament.
That's true.
So, anything else?
Which is kind of, this is a whole other rabbit.
Something
to
else.
chase.
We're going to chase a rabbit.
But, which is funny because the Jews knew the old law and they didn't accept Jesus. The Gentiles wouldn't have known it as well, and they were quicker to accept Jesus. So,
right. Well,
I don't know what that means. It's just funny.
Misunderstanding.
They had a misunderstanding about
That's right.
Jesus.
Yeah.
He wasn't who they wanted him to be.
Yeah.
Because they were tired of Roman rule, and they wanted a commander to come, a military leader.
Yep. And when we try to make the Lord in our image instead of making ourselves in His image,
there you
there's
go.
always a problem.
Yeah.
Which is what you could say that people have done even today, is try to make Jesus into this Americanized version of Jesus rather than the biblical version that we see, and the kingdom that He has established rather than the kingdom that we try to set up.
Right. But to tie it back together, if we have faith in Him, He's going to keep His promises, and
That's right.
we'll be good to go.
All right. Sounds good, guys. Next week, we'll continue this story and continue the story of the crossing, actually, into chapter 4 of Joshua. Don't forget, worship with us Sunday morning. Connect teams are in the activities building or in the main building here. And then we have Bible study on Wednesday nights as well, starting at 6:30 and going to 7:15. We're excited about all that and hope you will join us.
Yep.
All right, we'll see you guys next time.
Have a good week.